Okay, so let's talk about the commercial market for a minute. The commercial solar market is particularly interesting to me. This is where we're adding a battery bank to do load leveling. So normally, this is a sunny day of a large commercial building. This could be a 200 kilowatt array. This could be a high energy warehouse that uses 400 kilowatts of power. And what we see is normally the building would have a peak usage time in the middle of the day. But now we have a solar array turning on in the middle of the day, and so the solar array levels out that peak. And therefore, the peak load saving is that difference in value, which is almost the same size as the solar array for this particular kind of 9 to 5 business. And then the next day is kind of the same. This is probably out in California. You know, they get to work a little bit earlier in the day, and then they go home a little earlier. Well, the problem is not a overcast day when the solar array is not hardly doing anything, and then your building usage is also down as well. The problem is on a day like this where, you know, it's still sunny for the most part, but then, you know, some clouds roll over the array because, you know, at that time, it would look like your building demand looks like this, but all of a sudden it would spike up to the top again. And, you know what that means. It means you're going to get a high demand charge at the end of the month when your electric usage looks like that. And so where solar and batteries work really well together is that if you just had a solar array and then on a partly cloudy day, your demand spikes up to where it normally would be, so you had no demand savings, the solar array is only generating at the energy rate, which is about half of the retail price of electricity. It depends on the utility. So solar has only at the commercial level been able to get a generation rate equal to half the retail price of electricity. But batteries by themselves have not been good for load leveling because, you know, the battery would have to be large enough to load level for, you know, 6 or 7 hours to do any damage to load leveling. I mean, you'd have to have just a teeny tiny battery bank to shave off the very tip. But, you know, then the deeper you go into this drawing, you know, in other words, the wider your demand gets, as you load level, the larger your battery gets, and you get more diminishing returns. And so load leveling with batteries by itself has never made any economic sense. And solar by itself on commercial rate structures has never made any economic sense. But when you combine the two together, solar can provide the heavy lifting for day-to-day energy demand reduction management. And then the battery bank is sized just large enough to kind of turn on a little bit in the morning and then maybe do a little bit of recharging and then turn on again in the evening if needed. And it's not operating every single day. It may only be operating, you know, 1/3 of the days each month, or maybe even less than that. And so really it's the demand rate structure where batteries shine and can uncap some value that has not been there before. Because when a solar array owner generates at retail, you know, they're generating at retail at peak times. And unless they're on a time of day rate structure, they're not going to get credit for that. You know, when you get peak savings with a battery bank, your solar array is now uncapping the value of that peak electricity, which is worth more than average electricity. And so anyways, just remember that with batteries, you really do need a demand rate structure for a battery to be cost effective, unless you're in like Hawaii. So, you know, when is a battery cost effective? Well, you know, if every single day the difference between exporting to the grid versus charging a battery, when that retail price difference gets to be 30 cents a kilowatt or higher. That generally doesn't happen. Time of use rate structures are generally only available in the summertime and only available during the week and not during weekdays. So generally, unless you're in an extreme energy market, you're not going to have a residential battery be cost effective. It's more going to be an add-on for the homeowner to say, the installer can say, hey, let's put a battery on here and you're going to have backup power and it's going to cost you 10 grand. And maybe the homeowner goes for that, or maybe they don't. What I like about it is 3 years later, I can go back to the customer and say, hey, now that you've gotten your tax credit back, now that you've saved some money with your solar array, do you want to do the next step? Really, there's no problem with waiting in this market right now because the battery prices are still, we're still waiting for product to come to market. You really want to wait until the battery market is kind of oversupplied, which generally will happen about halfway through the production curve ramp up. We saw it happen in the solar industry too. And then you could also look at your fixed charges and say how much how much do I save on fixed charges. All right, and so let's see. Now on demand charges, you still have to have a pretty high demand charge for batteries to make sense. But here's the thing: like your electricity could cost 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and for a commercial customer, it could be a 5-cent energy charge and a $10 per kilowatt demand charge. And that's at 11 cents a kilowatt hour. That's at the average electrical price of electricity. Alternately, your business might be on something where it's a 3-cent energy charge and a 20 kilowatt demand charge, or dollars per kilowatt. So what's interesting about that is you can find regions where the price of energy is low, but the demand charge is really high. And so you might find a region where no one is doing solar power because residential solar doesn't make any sense at all, and no one knows anything about battery banks, and so commercial solar doesn't look like makes any sense at all. And the utility market, maybe the utility doesn't really support that many projects. So you can find regions of the country that have a low price of electricity and very little support for solar and no solar projects going on, but you still might find customers whose demand charges are at this like $14 on up point. If you are, I've seen these high demand charges in Con Edison and New York and out in California as well. But what fascinates me is these high demand charges are also in Mississippi. And what that means is that in a state like Mississippi, the most cost effective, in a state where solar is not subsidized at all, where there's no support for solar at all, that's evidenced by the number of solar projects. There's not many, but the most cost effective application of solar in an unsubsidized environment is where you have these high demand charges, because the battery only needs to work for, maybe 2 hours a day, and then the solar array can take care of the rest as far as demand savings. So, I would argue that the commercial solar market, the rooftop commercial solar market, is going to explode as soon as, LG Chem and Tesla and Mercedes actually ramp up their production volumes, which should be happening between now and 2020. Now let's do a exploration of this bill. We got this is an electric rate in a low cost of electricity market where you might have batteries costing $10 a kilowatt, electricity costing 6 cents a kilowatt hour, and your commercial fixed fee for a commercial building is $150. So, one thing that I like to think about is, well, what about that demand charge? It doesn't it costs electricity to run your battery. And that question, doesn't it cost electricity to run your battery, is really a question of efficiency. How efficient is it to charge the battery? How efficient is it to discharge the battery? How much energy do you lose by, the lower inefficiency of the battery inverter? So if you're doing demand management, aren't you going to see an increase in your energy charge? And might that justify a lithium ion battery that's more expensive than a lead acid, for example? Is because a lead acid battery system might be running at around 80% efficiency, whereas lithium ion may be closer to 95%. Let's just say. Well, the thing is, with batteries and battery applications, efficiency doesn't matter at all. And that might get some people mad. Doesn't efficiency matter? I mean, if you're putting a solar panel, a battery on the International Space Station, doesn't efficiency matter? Well, no, not really. And the reason is, when you're using a battery application, either you're grid connected and you're selling all the electricity into the grid, so the battery efficiency doesn't matter because you're not using it. The battery's just kind of hanging out for backup power. So no, if you're grid connected, the battery efficiency really doesn't matter. If you're off grid, if you're not grid connected, you are overkilling the solar array. Solar is so cheap now that in off-grid design, during the spring and during the fall, your solar array is producing so much electricity and your usage is down so much that you're you might as well put a water fountain in the middle of your house and have it burn extra electricity as a water feature, so that when your batteries are nice and healthy and you have this surplus power. And actually, the battery inverters have those kinds of load shedding features in them. Well, what about for demand management? Does the cost of cycling the battery, matter so much? Well, look, if I'm on a $10 a kilowatt demand rate and my energy charge is 6 cents a kilowatt hour, that means running my battery for 1 hour costs me 6 cents for my kilowatt hour. I'm not sure quite where I was going with this stuff. What I was thinking. Yeah. So my here we go. So my battery costs 6 cents to charge, and then it costs me 14 cents to cycle, in terms of the capital cost of the battery being reclaimed over its energy usage, plus the difference in efficiency, which I guess would may or may not be multiplied by this, or the cumulative of this. But in other words, this whole system is costing, let's just say, 20 cents a kilowatt hour to operate. And so running it for 10 hours, it's going to cost at 20 cents a kilowatt hour. Running the battery for 10 hours is going to cost me $2. But if by running the battery for 10 hours, I'm able to save $10, now I'm spending $2 to save 10, or I gain a $8 cost savings. And so if I'm saving $8 and I'm running it for 10 hours, whenever this battery bank is on, it's generating at, from 80 cents to $1 a kilowatt hour in profit. So does it really matter that I might be charging it at 6 cents a little bit more if it's flooded lead acid versus lithium ion? No. Charging the battery the cost of charging the battery is far below the cost savings that demand management has to offer. And so the energy efficiency aspect of battery technology, while it is there, it's kind of overblown. The reason why you would do a lithium ion battery instead of a lead acid is maintenance. There's monthly maintenance responsibilities, sometimes every 2 weeks during periods of heavy usage, that go into a flooded lead acid battery. And they're big and they're heavy. Whereas a lithium ion battery, you don't have to maintain it. And so you can say, well, lithium ion's more efficient than lead acid. No, you do lithium ion because you don't want to maintain your battery bank. You spend a little bit more money up front to get out of your maintenance responsibilities. And that makes sense. I work in the solar industry and I don't want to maintain a battery bank. So the reasons why you buy a battery bank are pretty simple. Residential customers buy lithium ion because they don't want to mess with maintenance and they want to enable backup power. Off-grid customers buy flooded lead acid because they have to. The commercial market's kind of up in the air. What I would do for the commercial market is, if I can do a flooded lead acid bank, like if I have a warehouse, like in an open air environment, I might do a lead acid starter battery and then anticipate doing a larger lithium ion project a few years from now. I think that makes a lot of sense. So from a solar installer point of view, this is kind of interesting. Let's compare the residential solar market, at a 250 a watt price point, compared to a commercial battery market where we have an additional dollar a watt budgeted for batteries. Now, that's not a hard and fast number. There is right sizing that goes on. There's software to help you do that right sizing. We'll talk about a little bit later. But here we are in Mississippi. Retail price of electricity is around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. The energy rate is about 6 cents, and we're at about a $15. So we're kind of halfway in between here at the kilowatt rate. So we're kind of halfway in between here at the payback. And so in a state like Mississippi, and this is assuming net metering, it's actually even worse because we don't have net metering in Mississippi. Now, we do have a program where the TVA will give you 12 cents. It's a little complicated, unnecessarily so, but the point is, at a 250 a watt install cost, which is low, for most of the country that has average production and average electricity pricing, you get this 250 a watt install price and you're going to have a payback of around 11 years. But the commercial battery market, which is a higher value, if you're an installer, you want to install at this higher value. You don't want to install at this lower value because, if you're making 30%, you want as large of a project as you can get. And so what's interesting is in Mississippi, the residential solar payback might be 11 years, whereas the commercial solar payback could be 7 or 8 because of demand management. Now, it just so happens, I didn't know this when I started looking into it, but Mississippi and the TVA region, outside of your high-priced electricity markets like California and the Northeast Coast, the TVA region has some of the highest demand charges in the country. So that's that was kind of surprising to me. But the takeaway is, anywhere where you start to see demand charges get into that $15 range, and in New York they can get even higher than that. But once you see demand charges go above 15 bucks a kilowatt, that's when you really want to start looking at batteries for the commercial market. And so we actually kind of have a clear path forward now on when to do batteries. It's pretty simple. It's if your commercial demand charges are above 15 bucks a kilowatt, you want to do batteries. If you're residential, we know what to do for off-grid, and otherwise it's, well, do you want to, buy a small lithium ion battery to provide power during a blackout or not. You're not really going to be making money off of that battery, even if you have a time of use rate structure available. And so what that might mean actually is you might find yourself in a market where solar payback is just not to the point where there's a market, but then you get into battery management with solar, and the market for solar might actually be grown by developing a battery expertise and targeting the commercial market. And a lot of, the thing is, you might want to check out your utility. These states, California, Georgia, Hawaii, Wisconsin, Alabama, Alaska, South Dakota, Wyoming, Virginia, North Carolina, Colorado, all of these states have piloted demand charge structures at the residential level. And so here we see residential service, residential energy storage, residential time of day, and then also this residential demand metered service. And so, like Arizona Power and Light is looking at solar specific demand charges. Colorado, the state of Colorado, instead of going with demand charges, they went over to mandatory time of use metering for all customers, all residential customers. So it's kind of interesting, and man, I feel real sorry for the utilities who are sizing up demand structures to counterbalance solar revenue loss, because solar is only 1 to 2% of the grid right now, and the bulk majority of solar is utility markets. So there's really not much revenue loss actually going on because of rooftop solar power. But if every business in the country on a demand rate structure can go out and buy a battery bank and get a reasonable return, that's the most profitable hour of the utility's month. So what's really going to go after utility profit margins is batteries. And normally I've always believed, and I've taught this in my classes, that the price of electricity does not go up. That in the United States, we have so much energy resource, and state-to-state energy transactions are much more friendly than international transactions, combined with great resources, energy resources. The United States electricity price has remained low. You go look at other countries, they're at twice our electric rate. The average home in Mexico uses 80% less electricity than in the United States. Their electricity costs a whole lot. And so we've been very, very fortunate in the United States to have this relatively cheap, almost staying slightly below the cost of inflation price of electricity. And that is sometimes misrepresented by the solar industry when they're trying to sell you the array. But I just don't see how, when cheap batteries come to the market, that the demand rate structures, are going to work without the utility making up that revenue elsewhere. And so either they're going to raise the energy rates, or they're going to raise the demand rates, or the total rate, but it's all revenue loss, and it can only be made up for by raising electric prices. So if 10% of utility revenue is lost because of demand, the average cost of electricity will rise 10% over a very short period of time because of the battery market. So it's a fascinating thing to see, like how the batteries are going to be much more impactful on utility rate structures than solar. In that sense, solar is like the warm-up round. Utility scale batteries cheap batteries is something that is almost making the solar debates a non-issue, because it's all about having a dynamic grid. A grid where electricity can flow one way and another is all possible now with solar and batteries, and also it's more secure. The grid's like a Tinker Toy set. One tree falls over one power line and it can send ripples throughout the entire system. A dynamic grid is more like the internet. You take out one node, the rest of the nodes remain on. So you combine the security of a dynamic grid with the low cost of the levelized cost of solar and then batteries, and it's like the utilities are just going to have to change their game. All right, so we looked at all this. As far as utility scale applications go, generally they're going to be going with AC coupling rather than or they're going to go with AC coupling rather than DC. Utility scale battery is to operate in that duck curve between the evening and nighttime when the solar arrays are going down and residential energy is climbing. There's no reason for that to be a DC coupled plant. I guess I should have moved this slide earlier when I was talking about Tinker Toys. And we teach a community solar class where we get more into green energy transactions and what goes on with these sales. But essentially, utilities are looking at saying, well, we have this problem where the system's going down because of our solar array setting. Right now our system is hitting. Anyway, y'all get the point. Let's see. Well, all right, so here's a graph of different battery markets, and what we can really see is that the lithium-ion market is taking over. There's another kind of battery that is supposedly the kind of next step in technological evolution called a flow battery. Theoretically, flow batteries can be cycled forever, and they're very robust. But the only flow battery that I know on the market's in Australia called Red Flow, and they recently announced that they're getting out of the residential market. So I don't know if like the newer technologies, it's kind of like thin film. People talk about it, it's still a ways from the market. They said they're focusing on utility scale applications. Lithium ion's grown like gangbusters. Lead acid's also growing. The sodium-based batteries, like saltwater batteries, there was a big name bankruptcy in that market called Aquion. So I don't, it's really kind of a AGM. It boils down to right now a battle between lead acid and lithium ion. Now, lead acid has always occupied the kind of default battery market. And the problem with lead acid is while it's fine for storage, it can't be really discharged fast. And what I mean by that is that the quicker you charge and the quicker you discharge a lead acid battery bank, the less efficient the process is. So if you wanted to instantaneously discharge a lead acid battery bank, you would hardly get any energy out of it. It would just be a lot of heat, I suppose. Whereas a lithium-ion battery is a little bit more responsive. And so on a, say, commercial load leveling battery bank, the advantage of lithium ion is as soon as you discharge the battery and the cloud is gone and the sun is back up, you can recharge the battery with your solar surplus. And that gets into a tax issue too, because to get the tax credit applied to your battery bank, there's like an 80% charging threshold that you have to have for just for it to qualify. And then because you're tracking the energy in from the solar array and the energy out from the battery bank, you actually have to take the tax credit in proportion to what the battery bank was actually charged with. So if it's only charged with 85% solar, you only get 85% of the battery bank eligible for the tax credit. And so it's important for commercial buildings who are taking that tax credit to have a battery bank that can be quickly charged and discharged during that cycle. And so lithium ion's a little bit better for that. And in California, they have a 30% state tax credit for batteries. And so the combination of the subsidies and the rate structure mean that most commercial customers are using lithium ion for load leveling. But you don't necessarily need lithium ion for residential. You know, with a residential battery, it's best to have a stable draw off your battery. You know, an electric tankless water heater is awful because a tank water heater can be 20 kilowatts of instantaneous power, and that just cannot come efficiently out of a lead acid battery bank. You know, it would be better to have an electric tank water heater that's less efficient. And during the day, you turn the tank on, and when you have this surplus power, make as much hot water as you can. And then the rest of the time, you just draw a little bit of current to keep the tank warm throughout the night. You know, so you want to manage your loads, especially in off-grid. You know, it would be better to have an air conditioner with a variable speed frequency drive so that it operates at a smooth, consistent power level rather than turning on and turning off and turning on and turning off. But customers, residential customers, while they don't necessarily need lithium ion, they want it because it's Tesla and also because, you know, there's no maintenance. So, you know, a lead acid battery bank you have to house. It'll produce gas. You know, and the gas is corrosive and toxic, so you want to vent it to the outside. It's hydrogen, so if it collects, it'll explode. You have to vent it to the outside. That's actually, it scares customers, but lithium ion is probably the more dangerous of the two technologies. It's much more energy dense. So that smaller footprint comes with a price. And when you locate a lithium, you know, with lead acid, these things get so big and heavy that typically you're building a little side room in your garage and putting them in there. So it's slightly conditioned environment, vented directly to the outside and contained. You know, lithium ion, you might start getting people putting lithium ion inside apartment buildings and skyscrapers. And, you know, if there's a fire with a lithium ion battery bank, it's not going to go out if it breaks through the shell. So I don't know. Lead acid, the impression is that it's dirty and that lithium ion is clean, or that you need the efficiency because of lithium ion. You know, no, it's lithium ion makes some arguments for commercial load leveling, and then it's the lack of maintenance that's the other big draw to it. You know, once it comes down in price a little bit more, it'll be competitive with lead acid. You know, really where I think it competes is there's the lead acid battery called an AGM battery, and it's a sealed zero maintenance lead acid battery. I don't see why you should get these anymore. I would just go with lithium ion at this point.